Good evening. This is Valerie Jackson bringing you another very special Between the Lines, coming to you from the Cecil B. Day Chapel at the Carter Center here in Atlanta. The featured book this evening is The Grace of Silence. My special guest is award-winning journalist Michele Norris, co-host of NPR's All Things Considered. Before coming to NPR, Michele was a correspondent for ABC News, where she earned both an Emmy and Peabody Awards for her contributions to the network's 9/11 reporting. As a contributor to segments of the World News Tonight with Peter Jennings show, she reported extensively on education, poverty, and numerous social issues. She's reported for the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and LA Times, and is a frequent guest on Meet the Press and the Chris Matthews Show. Last year, Michele Norris was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. She was especially recognized for her body of work covering the 2008 presidential campaign, wherein she covered both Democratic and Republican conventions, anchored debates, and delivered election and inaugural broadcast. She also helped to moderate a series of frank conversations with voters on the intersection of race and politics. The Grace of Silence is Michele's first book. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Michele Norris. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Valerie, it's so good to be with you.
Well, I mentioned just now you're moderating a series of conversations on race with during the 2008 election. That was, in fact, was it not one of the seeds for this book?
It was. I mean, the book is called The Grace of Silence, and there's two little words that hang out after that, separated by a colon. It's The Grace of Silence, a memoir. And whenever I look at the book, I always feel like there should be a set of parentheses or maybe an editing caret there to insert one additional word, the word accidental, because this was not the book I set out to write. Following that series of conversations with Steve, I wanted to write a book about how America was talking and thinking about race in the run-up to the election and in the wake of the election of Barack Obama, despite all the talk about America sliding into a post-racial position. I thought something else was going on based on the conversations I was hearing in the studio and as I traveled around the country, that people were thinking about race and talking about race and considering race in more animated ways. And I wanted to capture that. I wanted to eavesdrop on that conversation and write a series of essays from several different perspectives and several different points of view. And what happened is when I started listening to the hidden conversation, I started to pick up an interesting frequency very close to home when I sat down with my family members, and I realized that the elders in my family were suddenly just spilling stories, suddenly talking about things that were completely new to me. And it was like they had this disinhibition. I describe it as a kind of historic indigestion. You know, where stories were just sort of bubbling up and coming out. And some of those stories were funny, some of them were painful, most of them were incredibly profound, and a few of them shocked me to my core. And I had to follow those stories. They pulled me someplace else, and I realized that I had to write an entirely different book.
Well, W.E.B. Du Bois says that the duality of a black man's identity between the black and white worlds, or rather he said that there is a duality of a black man's identity, and that he acts one way among white people and another way among black people. But I glean from your book that there's a duality also going on within the black race itself. Talk about that a little bit.
Very much so. There is this incredible history that is in danger of being lost to us. That's what I realized, and I've become almost evangelical about this and talking about my story, sharing my story, and talking about the book. There are stories And there's a history that people not much older than us lived through, an incredible history. And we know the history was incredible because we celebrate it every February, Black History Month. We talk about civil rights in America, but it usually is that sort of history with a capital H, captured in documentaries and in history books. And this was not ancient history, so many of the people who live this on both sides of the color line are still with us, but they often don't talk about it. And so the duality in our families is often the secrets that are kept from us. And it's in part the way that we are shaped by all those things that we're told, but how we are also shaped by all the things that are never spoken of, and yet they still act as silent forces in our home. I was raised by parents who were both postal workers. They were proud people. They were quiet in their way, and in some ways quite ordinary, and that was okay. I mean, that was the life they led. They wanted to just be hardworking folks and let their work speak for them, and sort of the way they carried themselves through society. That's how they spoke. And I didn't realize that these seemingly ordinary people were sitting on such extraordinary stories because they never talked about it. They kept it to themselves.
Well, that brings up the question then as to whether or not we really should be unlocking these secrets. It could be a curse and a blessing. Which are you prepared for both?
Well, I don't know if I was prepared for both, but I endured both. Mm-hmm. You know, there is a bit of a conundrum here in that I wrote a book called The Grace of Silence, and I'm asking people in reading it to think about having conversations. My parents kept incredible stories to themselves, stories about their own pain and the indignities that they suffered in life, and I know I benefited from that silence because they didn't want to burden me with that. They didn't want to gunk up the engine of upward mobility, and I know that they benefited because they were able to move forward. They didn't wallow in some of these things that could have reduced them in some way.
You had a wonderful phrase in the book about not putting rocks in the pockets
Right.
of their children. Explain what you mean by
Well,
that.
my father, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about this because it's the real spine, the narrative spine of the book. My father lived through an act of violence that he never talked about. He was shot by a police officer, a white police officer, never talked about it. And he had lots of reasons perhaps to be angry, and it could have been easy for him to pass on his rage to his daughters, and he didn't. He kept it to himself. And I realized that some of that was so he could survive, but a big part of that, a very large part of that, was the hope for the future, that he wanted us to soar. The phrase that I always heard in my home was rise. You know, rise above it all, rise to the occasion, rise, do better, be better than good in all that you do. And if you want your babies to go out and fly, to soar, you don't put boulders in their pocket on the way out the door. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the reason that if I can just say this, Valerie, the reason that I come down in a slightly different place, even though I know they benefited, and even though I know I benefited from their silence in some way, is that I think that I benefited from their silence, but I also have benefited in important ways from knowing my history. Mm-hmm. So you might not want to put boulders in someone's pocket if you want them to soar, but maybe it's okay to put pebbles in their pocket, or even pearls, so that they're grounded.
Right. Tell us about your father. You just mentioned him. Talk about the Birmingham that he grew up in.
My father, I was raised in Minneapolis, but my father and his brothers, there were 6 of them, 6 sons of Birmingham, and if you buy the book, you will meet them in the pages and in the pictures in the book, and they were incredibly handsome, and they kind of knew it. And that's evident in the way that they would pose for these photographs when they went north and send them home. They were fine. And my father was toward the end of that pack. He was one of the younger brothers, and he was a very quiet man. And he had a very sunny disposition. And he was, by today's standards, you might say he was sort of Zen. He didn't talk loudly. He didn't say a lot. And when he did, it was often, what he said was often very wise. People that I barely kept in touch with in high school remained close to him to keep his counsel. They would always go back and ask him for his advice. He sent me back to Birmingham every summer. And that's part of the mystery of the story, that despite what happened to him, he remained closely tied to the city and made sure that I remained closely tied to the city, and I understood his Birmingham.
Even though the rest of the family, the rest of his brothers,
They went back
basically-
occasionally, but he sent us back all the time. And they were from Ensley, a neighborhood called Ensley, and it was a working class, largely black community, that section of Ensley, and it was in the shadow of the steel mills. And they didn't have a lot of money in Ensley, but everybody worked, and they were rich in social capital. It was a very tight-knit community, and that was the Birmingham that I remembered. And I would go down in the 60s, and you know, growing up in Minnesota in this integrated community, I'd go to Birmingham, and Birmingham was still a very bifurcated city. The Jim Crow laws had faded away, but customs continued, so it was a very segregated city. But it was, I realized in writing this book how much that Birmingham lived in me. It was a community that was very tight-knit, where you felt that everyone was pulling for you, and there were certain courtesies that I'm so glad that I was able to experience as a child. If you were walking down the street and Miss Miller asked you to come up and sit on the porch with her and have some lemonade and shell some peas with her, you would just say, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. And you would go up and sit and listen to her stories.
Give me one word that would describe your father.
Proud.
I wonder if it was that pride maybe then that kept him from sharing this secret with you. What was it that happened to him that night, if you share as much as you'd like to with us, at the, is it called the Pythian?
The Pythian
Temple. What actually happened that night that was so devastating to you in terms of your accepting it?
Valerie, many of these stories that came out seem to always come from my uncles. They were older, they are older, and they're in this period of disinhibition. I guess they've lived long enough where they feel like if I'm thinking it, I'm saying it. You know, I'm just going to put it out there. And one of my uncles, my father's last surviving brother, shared something with me. It was almost by accident. It just slipped out. I don't think he meant to tell me, but he told me that my father had been shot as a young man by a police officer, and I didn't know that. And I had to work very hard to get the spine of the story from relatives who were part of this conspiracy of silence and who gave me the basic facts. And I learned that my father was trying to attend an event in a building in the Black Business District at the Pythian Temple, and a police officer tried to stop him. And my father stood up to the police officer, and a scuffle ensued, and the police officer's gun was initially pointed at his chest, and one of his brothers, Woodrow, that was with him that night, swatted at the police officer's gun, and when it discharged, it was pointed downward, and so when the gun discharged, it grazed the side of my father's leg. He never talked about this. Moved north, never told my sisters, never told my mother. My mother thought that this wound on his leg was the result of a hunting accident from Alabama. She had no idea what this was about, and I had to try to understand not just the fact of the shooting. I mean, what was as much of a shock to me was not just that he was wounded, but that he stood up to a police officer.
In Birmingham.
Because to stand up to a police officer, this has happened shortly after you returned from war, so even if you were feeling your manhood, you know, even if you were still wearing your military uniform, to stand up to a white police officer in Birmingham, Alabama in 1946 was to invite a special kind of trouble. And I couldn't let that go. I had to put this in context. I had to understand what was going on in his mind, what was going on in Birmingham, what would lead him to do that. And that's how I wound up sliding not just into family history, but into these chapters of American history that I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know much about.
Your father was in the Naval, not in the Naval Academy, he was in the Navy.
No, he was not in the Naval Academy. No, not in 1943.
He was in the Navy. But he was very reluctant to display his naval photos and service medals. Why was that?
Well, I gained a lot of wisdom in this book. And I was always surprised as a kid that he didn't talk much about his military service. He entered the Navy in 1943 at a time where the Army at that point was accepting more men of color, and the Navy was looking in some ways to catch up with the Army. And he, at that time, if you were a man of color and you entered the Navy at the time, you had basically two choices. You were either a steward or a cook. If you played an instrument, you might have been able to play in the band, because there was a band at Great Lakes Naval institution where he served, where he first was sent. And in fact, in that band, the jazzman Clark Terry was actually there at the same time and wore on his uniform a musical note. But my father wore a C because he was a cook and a baker. What I didn't realize is that he didn't talk about his military service because as proud as he may have been, it was also difficult. He was marginalized in the military as many men of color were. And he didn't talk about his return to America because he was marginalized further when he returned to America, as many men of color were. When he was going to the Pythian Temple that night, the Pythian Temple was one of two buildings in the Black Business District that were buzzing in 1946. He was wounded on February 7th, 1946, and these buildings were buzzing with activity late at night, in part because there were all kinds of social events, because there were all these men of color who were returning veterans, and there were dances and whatnot, but there were also in those buildings classes every night, because they were learning. Birmingham was the center of a voting rights campaign, and it was centered around veterans, and veterans would attend these classes to learn as much as they could about the Constitution, because if they tried to register to vote, they would be asked by the registrar if they understood and could interpret any part of the Constitution that the registrar pointed to. That is what they would have. It was like a test that they'd have to pass in order to register.
That none of us could pass today, probably.
Right, and none of them, and most of them were not allowed to register. And when I learned this, a mix of very complex emotions washed over me, because you asked me about my father and his pride. My father rode the bus to work every day. Even though he had a beautifully maintained vehicle in the garage, he would not drive the car downtown because he was a frugal man and he didn't want to pay for parking. So he would take the bus, and I talked to the men who would all take the bus with him, and it was like clockwork. He arrived home on actually on Chicago Avenue and 49th at 5:35 every night on the same bus. And he carried in his back pocket most of his life a little teeny copy of the Constitution.
Wow.
And he would sit on the bus and he would pull it out and he would read that. And I'm ashamed to say that when I was a kid, I used to tease him about that little book in his back pocket. And I had no idea, what that meant to him.
You talk about the registering the veterans. That was a very serious issue back in those days, because during the war, a lot of the white men were off serving. They got very upset that they weren't inducting black men into the service, because as more white men left, most of the civilians or most of the citizens left were black men in terms of the male population. So that created another whole issue of resentment on the part of some of the white military, because they saw...
They were fighting the war and the others were left behind.
And the blacks weren't. But then, when they did get the blacks into the service and they were released, your book shares how after returning home, many of the veterans were discouraged in many and not subtle ways, discouraged not to register. As a matter of fact, was it Bull Connor that had a strategy to arrest returning veterans?
Yes,
to minimize.
It was a subtle campaign of terror. And there were the big surprises in this book, the tentpole surprises, that my father shooting and a few other astonishing things that I learned about my family. But there were the small surprises in the research that made this a very rich experience for me as an author, and perhaps for you as readers. I mean, you talk about the men who were enlisted and the men left behind. One of the things I discovered is that the military was under pressure for interesting reasons, because small-town mayors and councilmen were writing to the War Department saying, wait a minute, you're taking all the white men and all the black men are left behind, and we have this social imbalance. We have all these white women in these small towns and all these able-bodied black men, and you have to do something about that. And that was seriously, this is all written down in memos to the military, and that was one of the reasons that they started to take in men of color. And what happened is, when these black veterans returned, they marched off to war, and they were changed when they returned. And that goes back to the question of why my father would stand up. They wore this military uniform and it transformed them. They had a different relationship with America as a result. They saw an equality of service and experience when they looked at white men in that uniform and said, I'm wearing that same uniform. I feel like an American in a way that I never have before. And after participating in the fight for democracy, they came back to the United States with this crazy idea that they might get a taste of that back home. And America wasn't ready, and this is before the era of power to the people marches. This is before big afros and fists in the air. They wanted simple things. They wanted jobs and respect and access to the GI Bill when that was eventually rolled out. They wanted the right to vote. And America wasn't ready for that. And I realized when I dug into this that my father was part of this cohort that was at the center of this storm in America, that even though he was shot, he was actually quite fortunate. Fortunate because it was a superficial wound, but fortunate also because I discovered that in the first 6 weeks of 1946, now my father was wounded on February 7th, so that falls within that first 6 weeks. In the first 6 weeks of that year, a half a dozen black veterans were reportedly killed by police officers in and around the city of Birmingham for things like moving the colored-only sign on a bus, or for going to register to vote and having their picture appear in the newspaper. There's a picture in the book of these men who marched through the streets to register, and the local black newspaper in Birmingham would not run that picture. I found it in the Chicago Defender, and then I had to track down the woman who actually took the picture because they were afraid that if they ran that picture, that they would be the targets of an investigation or possibly something worse. So that was in the first 6 weeks. And then the more I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just Birmingham. In fact, it wasn't just the South. Throughout the year in 1946, black veterans, often still wearing uniforms, were beaten and burned and maimed and lynched and blowtorched and castrated. It was the blinding of a veteran named Isaac Woodard 3 hours after he had been honorably discharged from Fort Gordon here in Georgia. He was pulled off a bus because he said something to a bus driver that the bus driver didn't like. The bus driver called ahead, made sure a police officer met him in Batesburg, South Carolina, near Aiken. The police officer pulled him in an alley and beat him so badly about the eyes that medical examination showed that his eyes were pulverized. Harry Truman, upon hearing about this case and upon seeing how that case was adjudicated, and the police officer accused of this was acquitted within a half hour, and the jury erupted in applause. He was so troubled by this that he wrote a series of letters to many of his close friends, and he appointed a 15-member civil rights commission that wound up becoming the first steps toward the full integration of the armed services. Now, wherever I've gone in the country, I've asked people if they've ever heard of Isaac Woodard, and most of them say no, because that history is lost to us, and that goes to that duality you talked about.
Yes.
The people who lived it decided to stop talking about it. That was part of their survival strategy. They left it behind like a suit that no longer fit. And for people who had so many reasons to be angry, they decided to move forward, not with rage, but with ambition. And that's why I used the word grace in the title of this book, because to go through an experience like that and to decide that I'm not going to be angry. In fact, I'm going to show America what I can be by leading a life of utter rectitude. I'm going to show America what it can be. And that is to, in some way, take your shoulder and shove the whole country forward.
Yes.
That's an incredibly graceful act.
Well, if you've just joined us, I'm Valerie Jackson, and we're coming to you from the Carter Center, where I'm going between the lines of The Grace of Silence by Michele Norris, whose voice is heard by millions every weekday as co-host of NPR's All Things Considered. I'm just glad you don't come on at 7 p.m. on Friday nights. Tell us about your mother now. She was quite a woman in her own right. Let's talk about her for a moment.
Well, my mother is a very strong woman. She didn't know about my father's experience, and as I learned this, I took her along on a rather tumultuous journey, and I am so thankful that she stayed in the boat, because to write a family memoir is to pull along family members. along on a journey through the rapids, and they didn't ask to get into the boat. Mm-hmm. And she stayed in there with me.
Well, I'm sorry. She really kind of dismissed the shooting. Well, not dismissed it, but she said, "Well, that's crazy." When
she didn't believe it at
right,
first.
Right.
She didn't believe it.
Why was that? Why
well, you know, because it didn't make sense to her. You know, and I think in some parts she understood the silence. You know, maybe she didn't want me rooting around there. You know, a secret was kept from her, but it turns out that she was sitting on an incredible secret also. My father never told her about this shooting. And imagine, you know, in all the intricacies of marriage, that something like this happened and, you know, and your husband never told you about it. But it turned out that she was sitting on a pretty incredible secret also, and it was a secret that was revealed to me by yet another one of my uncles. And, you know,
Thank goodness
always,
for uncles.
Yeah, and it always happened over food. You know, we were always like sitting down, having a meal, and these stories would spill out. In this case, though, the uncle that spilled the story, that my mother had kept her secret, I think that uncle was strategic. I think he shared that story with me on purpose. He knew that I would go digging and fill in the blanks. He revealed to me, he talked to me about some work that my grandmother, that my mother's mother had done in the late 1940s and early 1950s, something my mother and her sisters had never, ever, 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 ever talked about. And when Uncle Jimmy told me this, she was so angry at him that I thought she was going to snatch him bald-headed. She was just fatutzed. And when I reveal to you the secret, perhaps you'll understand why. My Uncle Jimmy explained to me that my grandmother Ione, a woman that I always remembered as a committee woman, as someone who was very polished and quite authoritative, had spent her early years in the late 1940s and early 1950s traveling around the country as an itinerant Aunt Jemima.
Aunt Jemima, like the pancake mix. Aunt Jemima.
Yeah, and not like, no, you know, if our audience and your listeners think about Aunt Jemima, they might think about the Aunt Jemima that's on the pancake mix today. And that's not what I'm talking about. If you use Aunt Jemima pancake mix or Aunt Jemima pancake syrup, the woman who smiles back at you looks like she might be on the church council. You know, she's got pearls and she gets her hair done every Tuesday. She's got a, you know, looks like she shops at Lord & Taylor or maybe Macy's. She's had a makeover. But the Aunt Jemima that I'm talking about in the late 1940s and early 1950s looked like a slave. And my grandmother would dress up like this woman. She would wear a hoop skirt and a headscarf, and she would travel to small towns doing pancake demonstrations at a time when pancake mix was new and novel, and the idea of add water and stir cooking was quite new in America. And she was teaching farm wives how to do this and gathering reconnaissance for the company about how people took to this product. And my mother didn't want me to talk about this, didn't want to talk about it to me. In fact, it said, talk about it when I'm going.
Why was she ashamed? It was an honest job. What was the shame in it for her?
You know, dressing up as a slave woman was something, I understood the complicated emotions around that. And it was in the time when civic organizations like the Urban League and the NAACP were urging Quaker Oats to cut it out. They were saying, get rid of the slave woman on the pancake package. And my mother and her sisters were quite involved in civic activities. And so on one hand, to be, you know, pushing for these things, and while their mother was also dressed as Aunt Jemima, you know, traveling around. She had a 6-state region. It included Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and the Dakotas. I understood that. And but I had a series of different, I had a slightly different reaction. First of all, she's my grandmother, so I'm not gonna be ashamed of her. I was interested because I was almost kind of fascinated, Valerie, because I thought, wait a minute, she's traveling in the 40s and the 50s. Who did that? Women didn't travel
That's
in the 40s
what I was
and the
impressed
50s.
with.
And black women certainly didn't travel. So I thought, well, that, and treated like a celebrity when she arrived. But I also was fascinated in an odd way because I have very strong memories of my grandmother. Her name was Ione Brown, and as I said, she was a woman she was very bossy, and she was always running things. She founded a senior citizen center in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. It still bears her name. And to make sure that you understood that she was a woman of authority, she carried herself in a certain way. And she dressed in a certain way. And she would always look like she meant business, even if she was just going to the grocery store. So she wore these ensembles that were sort of like garanimals for adults. So if it was a lavender day, the whole thing would be lavender, the brooch, the little lace collar. If it was a red day, that everything would have hints of red. And this was always topped off by a silk scarf to protect her well-coiffed hair. And when I thought of her as Aunt Jemima, I had to go someplace completely different. I had to think of her not with a silk scarf, because you wouldn't even call it a scarf, right? You'd call it, what, a do-rag? A kerchief?
Oh.
I had to think about her with a different kind of scarf, not tied here, but, pulled
like
back here.
The bandana.
And tied up on top of her head.
And it's interesting too, because when and I get this from your book also, back in the early days of the Aunt Jemima, it was a very, the literature that went with the campaign was rather, was filled with African or Negro dialect that was not correct grammar, and other more or less negative images.
Highly negative. And, when my grandmother was doing this, Quaker Oats was one of the 2 largest advertisers in the country. So if you had picked up a newspaper or a magazine, Saturday Review or Ladies' Home Journal, you would most certainly find advertisements for Aunt Jemima, and they were big, full-page ads, and they were actually quite beautiful. Wyeth would do Nancy Wyeth would do it was actually painting, and it was lovely, and there was a lot of text, and in this text, they described this myth of Aunt Jemima, that she worked on this plantation that was run by Colonel Higbee, and people were always flitting around her forever, asking her for her pancake recipe, because it was said to have almost special properties. I mean, Confederate soldiers would be wounded, and they would stumble out of the woods, and they would see this cabin in the distance, and it had smoke rising from it, and they would follow the smell of these pancakes, and she would serve them stacks of flapjacks, and they would emerge from her cabin strengthened for the fight. I mean, all of this spelled out in several column inches. And in those stories, Aunt Jemima, when she spoke, always used this sort of slave patois. It was, it made it clear that she was somewhat dim-witted. She was uneducated. And the more I learned about Aunt Jemima and how this myth was created, that was part of the strange fascination I had, because my grandmother was someone who spoke with extremely sharp diction, and these women who speak that hit every consonant as if it had a knife edge. And when we were young, if we were talking about how we were fixing to do something or how we were planning to do something, she would say, excuse me, did you leave Mr. G outside?
Yep.
He's kind of cold. Maybe you should invite him inside and let him warm up next to the rest of that word. And so I had to try to figure this out, and I don't know. I never talked to my grandmother about this. She died in the early 80s before I learned of this work. And I don't know what she said to herself, because I think about myself when I get dressed in the morning and I get ready for work and I try to get my, myself just right, and I'm putting on my makeup and adjusting, my outfit. I don't know what she said to herself in those moments. I don't know what kind of hard bargain she did when she was pulling on that hoop skirt or adjusting that kerchief, that do-rag on her head, but I got lucky in that I found newspaper clippings of her traveling to these small towns, and when she talked to reporters, I don't know what she told herself when she got dressed, but when she stepped out at the Piggly Wiggly or the Kroger's or the Red Owl or the Pancake Supper or the county fair, she said that she would carry herself in a certain way because she knew she was going to all these small towns where they had never seen a Negro woman before. And she wanted to make sure that when they saw her, they were left with a favorable impression. So she wouldn't use the slave patois. If you met Ione Brown in one of these small towns. And I have met people in my book tour who remember seeing her come to their small towns. They've signed my book. And the woman that they remembered, they did, she did leave them with a favorable impression. She focused on the children because she said, if I can show them what a Black woman can be, what a Negro woman can be, maybe I will contribute to their view of the world. And she sang gospel songs. And so when I was able to take this secret that the family sort of didn't want to touch and bring back new information about what Aunt Jemima was and about what my grandmother did and about what I learned of all the other regional Aunt Jemimas, because there was someone who had the, for instance, Alabama, Georgia region, who was traveling to church suppers and county fairs and general stores here in this state during these demonstrations. I was able to give the family a gift in that they saw, and it made that story go down so much easier because they saw that my grandmother took a job that so easily could have been denigrating and did it in her own way. She lifted herself up through her earnings and lifted her people up through her actions.
You did quite a bit of investigating in your own family about racial issues. But one of the things you talk about in the book is the difficulty that it is to get information from the other side. The victim, the one who's oppressed, we have no problem getting their stories. But those who have oppressed in the past, it's difficult to get their stories. And it may be because we're judging them from a different time and place. But how do you encourage the rest of the country, who are not African Americans? How do you encourage them to start this conversation that might help bring the two sides to the table so that we can talk about it over some food? Yeah. What role can the white population play in this race issue? W.B. Du Bois, he's one of my favorites, that's why I always quote him, once again said that the problem of the 20th century and the 21st century is the color line. But, there are two sides to the color line.
Exactly.
And Black people alone are not going to be, able to solve the problem alone. There's going to have to be some white leadership in the package.
I tried to do it through curiosity. It was very important to me in reaching back and looking at society in the 40s and the 50s and understanding my family's story that I try to understand life on the other side of the color line. I felt I had to do that. As a journalist, I was interested in that. I thought if I didn't do that, I would only be getting one side of the story. And I feel that the story of race in America is not just a story of Black people's experience of race in America. It's all people's experience of race in America. And I understood the difficulty, because it's easier to talk about, when we talk about civil rights, we so often talk about it through the prism of the people who have overcome, who march through the streets singing "We Shall Overcome." It's a convenient handle to tell that story, to talk about the overcoming of oppression. It's much harder if you are among the group of people who enforced segregation, who embraced segregation, who enjoyed segregation, or perhaps are even sorry to see it go. It's harder to talk out loud about your experiences, but I found that when I tracked down the family of the police officer that blinded Isaac Woodard, when I tracked down police officers who were actually on the force under Bull Connor to try to understand what their life was like, that they were grateful that I even wanted to hear their stories. Sure. And some of what I heard, readers will find disturbing. I mean, some of it will make you squirm, but guess what? It's race. If you want to have an honest conversation about race, some of it is going to make you squirm. I think it's so essential that we figure out a way, and maybe that's the the race cards that I distribute, the effort that I've made in traveling around the country in these conversations about the book to encourage people to talk to their own families. It's not just people who were on the Black side of the color line or the Latino side of the color line that should perhaps be interested in examining their family history. There are histories that are also kept, covert, that are kept hidden, that are that are sort of these sub rosa stories on the other side of the color line as well, because it's hard to figure out how to pass on that story. And I find that if I talk about my story, that people are sometimes willing to examine their own or share their own. I've experienced that on my website, where people have shared what it was like to grow up in a family where they loved their parents or they questioned their values, or where they realized that the ground quite literally shifted under their feet when the rules and the mores and the customs in society changed. Those stories are essential to understanding race in America as well.
And we have to figure out a way, too, where we can talk about race without it becoming an issue of racism.
There's a difference.
Yeah, yeah. Because I believe there was a young woman in your book that said, talking about when you were trying to get some response from the white community, she said, my God, we can't say anything. I mean, regardless of what we say, if we say anything at all about race, people call us a racist. And so they're afraid, perhaps, to even voice a reality. But I believe the bottom line is you do what you know, and when you know better, you do better. So
and you listen. You know, that it is, people think that the most important thing that we do as broadcasters is talk. The most important thing we do is listen. And the most important part of a conversation is the listening. It's not just the talking. Right now we are so focused as a society on communication, on new ways to communicate, to text each other, to talk to each other on devices that seemingly get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's all about talking and tweeting and Facebooking and communicating outwardly as opposed to absorbing other people's stories. And you know, even though I called this book The Grace of Silence, I want so much for it to be the starting point for a conversation. And one way that you can begin that conversation is to honor someone by being willing to listen to their stories. And part of, you know, Dave Isay, who founded StoryCorps, the National Oral History Project, he says that listening is an act of love. When it comes to race, listening is also an act of courage. Because what you hear might be very disturbing. Mm-hmm. I mean, in my family, I inherited a painful and ultimately very complex racial legacy, but I'm so thankful that I know this history now, and I'm so thankful that I can pass it on to my children. I mean, in my case, it's about race, but people have complex histories. That's something we shouldn't be ashamed of. I mean, if your family lived through the Dust Bowl or the Depression, if your family survived the Holocaust, chances are they might not have shared the entire story with you, and it's worth trying to capture that, even if it takes you to painful places. Before we had currency, you know, that had dead presidents and important buildings, you know, on pieces of paper, before there were coins that had value, a person's wealth was often wrapped up in their history. What kind of story they had to tell. And someone was determined to be quite wealthy if their story was rich. And if their story was rich, it was not because they lived a life where the sun was always shining and it was sort of this flat line. If their story was rich, it was because they saw peaks and valleys. They knew triumph and they knew struggle. And that was a story that they could tell probably, you know, ages ago over campfires or you know, when oral history was the way that story and that wealth was passed on. It's important for us to maybe think about that in our own families, and particularly think about that in the story of race. It is a rich story, and even if it's painful, if you look at where we've come and what we've survived, if you focus on the evolution, it's worth mining for that story, and it's worth taking the time to capture it.
So what's the simple question we need to ask our elders, especially, if we want to know more?
Well, as you said, do it over food.
Over
I mean,
food.
if it's, you know, if you're talking to, if you know that they love pineapple upside down cake, have a big slab of it. And if they like the piece that's sort of burnt on the corner, make sure they get that piece and put a dollop of whipped cream on it. But I encourage people to ask simple questions, like building a house one brick at a time. You might not get it all at the beginning, but ask the kind of questions that enliven their senses. You know, what did you do for fun on a Saturday night? Tell me about the smells in your grandmother's kitchen. What was your favorite baseball team? What was it like when you went to Rickwood Field in Birmingham and saw the Birmingham Barons or the Birmingham Black Barons. Get them, open the spigot by making them comfortable. And then once they're there and once you know that you've earned their trust, then maybe you can start to ask some of the more direct questions. And what happens is you better be ready when you do, because the family members who talked to me who didn't want to talk, once they opened up, they're like, girl, you wanted to know about this, you better sit down because I have something to say.
Well, that's good, that's good. And just a simple question like, tell me about yourself, could start it. This has been a revealing conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But thank you so much, Michele Norris, for allowing us to go between the lines with you this evening.
Valerie, it's been great to be with you.
Well, that's it for this week. Until next time, I'm Valerie Jackson, reminding you that there's always more to learn when you go between the lines. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking in that great conversation. I loved it. Can't wait to read the book. My wife had me purchase it, and I'm glad I did. One question I wanted to ask, you spoke about this a good bit with your parents, the idea of putting boulders or rocks in their pockets as they try to progress and move forward. For yourself in that own statement, how have you navigated that with your own children and that sense of having the richness of race that we deal with? And as we move forward, how we kind of pass on to our children what we want them to have, but not burden them too deeply?
That's a tough one. You know, I get this question all the time, and I struggle with it because, as I said, I know I benefited from my parents' silence, but I know I also benefited now from knowing their history. And I want to share that history with my kids, not because I want them to think that they get special treatment because bad things happened to our family in the past. That is not the message I want to pass on, but I do want them to understand where we have been as a family and as a society so that maybe they will appreciate where we are right now. I want them to know that they are stronger than they think they are because they can look at the trail that their family has followed, and I want them to know that bad things may happen to them, but it doesn't have to define them. And that's a very important message. And my children are young. I have a 10 and an 11-year-old, and I have a 25-year-old stepson. And as they get older, the pearls or the pebbles can get larger. You know, and I realize I can talk to them about things that are more complex. But I'm going to be honest with you. It's very difficult because on one hand, I have to decide whether I hold my tongue or whether I respond to that voice I hear in my head. I mean, my parents, you know how you sort of become your parents at some point. And it happens. And my parents, for instance, would just, in the 70s when we were wearing those farmer's overalls.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember those, the painter pants? And they just, you wearing sharecropper clothes when you go downtown? What are you doing?
You're not going out of my house looking like that.
Yeah, you know, they just didn't understand it. And they were always concerned about, you know, what the kids would call representing, dressing well. So, you know, when my sons decide to go out and they want to wear the big, puffy North Face jackets and the really baggy, saggy pants and the shoes that they don't lace up because I guess that's fashionable because Kanye doesn't lace up his shoes, so they're not going to lace up their shoes. You know, do I say to them, you're not going out like that? Do I tell them, you know, to go upstairs and change, or do I let them wear these clothes because it's fashionable? Because if I may be really honest, I know that Seth can wear those clothes because they're fashionable. And Julian can wear those clothes because they're fashionable. But if my son wears those clothes to the mall, is he going to attract attention when he goes into a store? Are people going to follow him a little bit closer? I don't want them to go looking for something that I hope they'll never find. But I know that it's quite possible that if they do wear some of those kinds of clothes, that's what may find them. And that's something that I say, let it begin with me. I'm being honest. And that's something that I wrestle with.
Have you taken your children, the young children, to Birmingham yet?
No, they have not gone to Birmingham. They are going to go soon. The archivist who helped me work on this book, I've developed a close friendship with him. He's close in age to me. He's a white man, and we often we muse about how we might have passed each other on the street as kids, and our worlds, we grew up in a completely different universe. And he's come to Washington, and his daughter and my children have become friendly, pen pals. They read books and talk to each other. And I now need to take them to Birmingham so they see my Birmingham. But again, that's difficult because the Birmingham that I knew in Ensley is much diminished. And that is in part because of integration. You know, when the families that had the means to move out, it's no longer the community where the ditch diggers and the doctors send their sons and daughters to the same schools and live in the same communities. And when those who had the means to move on, moved on, those who were left behind were really left behind.
Michele, do you think the generation today appreciates how far things have changed, how much things have changed in what, to me, seems like a relatively short span of time, how different it was, say, when I was growing up?
I hope they do. I hope they do, but I sense that sometimes they don't. You know, that this is the stuff of, as I said, of history books and documentaries and things that they talk about usually in the month of February. And one way we can make sure that they do appreciate that is by talking about it in our families, by talking about it in our communities and in our churches and in our civic organizations, so that those experiences are animated, so that they understand that it's not just ancient history, and so they appreciate some of that. I mean, one of the more interesting things I've discovered in talking about young people, or talking to young people, is a strange burden that they feel. And maybe this goes back to all of this talk about moving into a post-racial society. I have talked to so many college students and high school students and people who are, young adults, who are so let down when they experience the conundrum of race, or when they realize they see something in their life that doesn't make sense, and they feel like they have let society down because they got the message that it was supposed to be not just easier, but easy. And when they experience something that feels like discrimination or some sort of racial injustice, it's very hard for them because they feel that they were supposed to be the generation that scored the touchdown, that pulled us, into that better place.
Yes.
Hi. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your research and your writing process. It sounds like you combined not just the personal stories with your family, but the coverage that you did, while at Morning Edition. And I wondered sort of how you balanced navigating, these personal narratives as a writer into these more like larger historical, pieces, and when you knew you needed to make that shift, and what kind of gave you the sense that you had enough of the history to move back into the personal narrative.
I don't know. This is the first book I've written, and I didn't plan on writing memoirs, so I did a quick read of Zinzer, and that sort of helped me. But I got pulled into this history and sort of dove into it and realized that I had to tell my story, but I had to put it into context. And I was facing a pretty tight deadline. I wrote this book in the span of a year. So I could have kept going, and I have kept going and researching some of this, but I had a pretty fixed deadline. And I wasn't sure it was going to work, because it is a mixture of history and personal narrative, and it's a very complex structure in the book. It's not a linear telling of the story. You slide back and forth. I felt like you had to understand who my parents were before you understood what happened to them. So it's a very untraditional structure, and I had a fantastic editor who sort of got in the boat with me and helped me weave this, and we took it apart and put it together. It was like playing Jenga, and figuring out how the pieces were going to come together. You asked me about the writing of this. I was terribly intimidated when I started writing this. I write every day. I write for the radio. I wrote in television. I was a newspaper reporter, and I worked in network television. I write all the time. But writing a book was something different for me. And that blank page in a Word or a Pages document in Mac it just reduced me. And I knew that I had to write this in my own voice. It had to feel, it was the way I tell stories, and I thought that readers are used to listening to me, so they wanted to hear a certain cadence in the writing that they were used to hearing on the radio. And so what I would do is when I sat down, instead of opening just a blank page, I would open an email document. And I would write what I was working on that day as if I was writing to my sister or my best friend Gwen Eiffel or my husband or at some point Jim Baggett when I was doing research back and forth, or another, someone who was helping me do research at the Chicago Defense. People I'd met along the way or people in my life. And I would write more freely, and I would write in the sort of strange syntax that I would use when I was writing emails, and that freed me to write in my own voice and to write in fragmented sentences in the way that I would speak. And then I would take that and cut and paste it and move it into a document and gussy it up and turn it into English. And that freed me, to write in that way. And when I was doing the research, similarly, I felt, well, I wonder if I have to be like Edmund Morris. I wonder if can I do this? And I said, wait a minute, I'm a reporter. This is what I do. I report, I dig. And so I just let curiosity guide me. And I was unafraid to ask questions and unafraid to dive into this as if I were researching a story. In this case, it just happened to be the story of my life, the story of my family. Thank you for your question.
Let's go over here.
Yeah, I was thinking about your comments about your grandmother and Aunt Jemima, where in Atlanta in the late 1950s, the two most popular restaurants among middle-class whites were Mammy's Shanty, perfect Aunt Jemima, and Aunt Fanny's Cabin,
Right.
where the menu was read or recited to you by little black boys in elementary school, shuffling and dancing and telling you about the fried chicken and everything else. And I remember when I was their age, and I was thinking, what are these kids doing out on a school night? It's like, what? No child labor laws? And I think that one of the things that needs to be done is take Black History Month out of February and make it year-round. It is your total history. And learning where you came from and what changed it, the fact that it was a movement.
Wouldn't it be interesting to celebrate Black History Month by just looking at white America's involvement in the civil rights movement? And not even the involvement in terms of freedom riders, but the experience of white America in those tumultuous years. I mean, I often, think about that and why is it just February? But if I get to say something about Aunt Jemima, I have become fascinated with Aunt Jemima. I mean, she lives on. It's sort of amazing to me that Aunt Jemima, even with the makeover, is still with us. And there's so much psychology wrapped up in what she represents. And, she's had a makeover and she's different. She looks different.
She's been demammified.
Yeah, but you just try to call a black woman Aunt Jemima and see how demammified she's been.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So it's
Oh, yeah.
it's really complicated. And yet, on the other hand, when I was doing research on this, when I thought I was still writing the other book about the history of race, I was asking everyone I talked to at the end of the interview, I would say, what do you think of Aunt Jemima? And they would be like, what? What? I was talking to, researchers about implicit cognition or, whatever it happened to be.
How do we get to pancakes?
And they just thought I was crazy. I said, I'll tell you why I'm asking this question in a minute, but just roll with me here. What do you think about her? And it was sort of like my flash poll on Aunt Jemima, and it really depends on your experience. I went to a different restaurant in Natchez, Mississippi, and when you read the book, you'll read about this. There is a restaurant, and some of you may have seen it. It's a restaurant that's inside a giant Aunt Jemima. There's a name for these buildings. I don't know, like camera stores that look like cameras and auto stores that look like giant tires. This is a restaurant that looks like a giant Aunt Jemima. I mean, the restaurant is inside her hoop skirt. You can see her for miles from the road, and she, like the woman on the pancake package, has had a makeover. They made her skin lighter. I don't know what that was about, and they took her nose and narrowed it, and she had a breast reduction, and But the restaurant is still in her hoop skirt. And I wanted to talk to the woman who runs the restaurant, because I said, what is it like to run a restaurant which is quite popular all day with black people and white people and Latinos and Asians, whoever happens to live in the community. It's known as the place to go have lunch. And I wanted to ask her, what it was like. And she said, you know what, I understand that people are very upset about Aunt Jemima, but let me tell you something. Here in the South, many of us, by tradition or culture, had people in our lives who worked in the kitchen, who helped raise the children, who worked in church, and some of us were closer to the mammies in our life than we were to our mamas. And we love these women so much. And she said, you may not agree with her.
Was this the black or a white woman
She's a
saying
white
this?
woman, and you may not agree with her, but she says, listen, this is a woman who's so honored that she said, I don't understand why Black America doesn't embrace her more, because wasn't she yours first?
Interesting.
And then I talked to Horace Huntley, who runs the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, and I asked him at the end of a long interview, so what do you think about Aunt Jemima? And he was like, what? Why are you asking me this? But he got very emotional. And he said, you know what? Aunt Jemima looks like my grandmother. And she's the smartest woman I've ever known, even though she didn't have a day of education. And that advertising campaign is supposed to make me feel ashamed of this woman I love so much. And so he talked about the, imagery controlling what you think of yourself and what you think of your people. And I realized that woman on that pancake box is like a Rorschach test. And,
Yes.
and as I say in the
Yes.
book, she's not holding up a spatula, it's like she's holding up a mirror. And what you see in that mirror is determined by what you've lived in your life. And I couldn't get Quaker Oats to talk to me, but I'm deeply fascinated, because I've had people who work for Quaker Oats contact me and say, this is still tough for us. I mean, they still...
Well, they've got one of the most famous icons in advertising history.
Which is why they can't back away from it.
That's
I'm just
what
going to say
I'm
one
talking
last thing.
about. Go ahead.
I mean, I didn't write about this, but it's interesting how Uncle Ben has evolved. Because Uncle Ben they took a sort of a different tack. Uncle Ben has had a makeover too, but he runs the show. I mean, Uncle Ben wears a suit now, and he has a corner office. If you go to the website for Uncle Ben, they've decided it's sort of like Benson.
Oh, really?
Remember the TV show Benson?
Yes.
One year he was a butler, and then the next year he was like the governor. And that's sort of what Uncle Ben is like. He has the corner office, and you can go through the corner office, and they took the history and decided to incorporate that. And you can laugh about it, but it's very interesting, because that up from slavery narrative that's my family story. And so why it's complicated, and why I would bristle if someone called me Aunt Jemima. Well, that's part of where we came from. And so if with a little bit of courage and cunning, the company might be able to do something interesting with that.
My question is, do you have any sense, I think your talk has been great, but is there any reason why today there's such an apathy in the media overall about this traumatic stuff that's going on now, that hopefully 50 years from now there will be somebody on a stage talking about, but right now there's nobody advocating for these people in any major way?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with you there's nobody, because I think
Well,
there are
there's some,
people
but it's-
advocating, but I do see your point that it's not a front and center discussion. This maybe goes back to this thing, it's circular, we keep coming back to it, the things that we don't talk about. There are lessons to be drawn from this history, from this civil rights history, and not just from that in the mid to late 60s, but the civil rights history that began really decades before that, the drive towards social justice. Because what this included was people who stood up and spoke their truth, or spoke truth to power, who stood up against a power, a system of power, people who put their lives on the line, people who lived their beliefs, people who suffered sometimes because of that sometimes physically because of violence, but sometimes because they were pilloried in their communities. But there is a history of social justice there and people standing up and doing what they believed was right. And that's another reason why it's worth talking about some of those things, because you learn that by only focusing on the late 60s, the point at which the customs and the laws fell away and the overcoming of the tyranny of racism, you don't understand the struggle that led to that, the courage that led to that, the individual decisions that led to that. And if you understand that, you perhaps are more able to learn from that and apply that to the other things that you see in your life that doesn't make sense.
I wanted to know if your grandmother lived to see you as a journalist,
Oh.
because I feel like you have her voice.
It's funny that you say that, because I think about the representing, going out. I'm very aware of that when I do go out. She saw the very beginnings. I was still in school and I was writing for the college paper, but she didn't see this. And my father saw the bylines, didn't see me work in television, and never heard me on the radio. And that as someone who listened to public radio all the time, I grew up essentially as a prisoner of public radio.
He loved Orson Welles,
Yes.
didn't he?
Yes,
Yeah.
and so he would have quite enjoyed that.
Yes, sir.
I think the idea of silence on one's racial identity is, for the self-preservation, basically, is an interesting idea. And I was wondering if you see any parallels between the concepts you're talking about in your book with your family and kind of the modern discourse on race, the mantra of which is, color blindness, or to claim that race is invisible and, you don't see it, you're just making a judgment on someone's character.
I'm going to be honest here. The concept of color blindness, based on what I've seen in my travels and what I've learned in research about race, is just a sort of interesting idea. I don't know why we would necessarily want to be color blind. You're talking about if you're colorblind, you don't see colors, you don't see the hues, you don't see, everything is sort of rendered in shades of gray. And I think part of what makes America interesting is that it is such a rich tapestry. Part of what makes this room interesting is that I look out and I see a sea of faces that don't all look quite the same. And so to take the color out of the picture, there's a reason we don't watch black and white television anymore. It's because it just is more interesting if there's color included. So I don't know. When people talk about post-racial America, I'm not even sure what that really means. And that goes to this thing that we were talking about, the difference between race and racism. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that perhaps people talk about color blindness or taking, when I understand the concept of treating people equally, but I don't want to erase my racial identity. It's part of who I am, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't see that as a negative. There's a difference between race and racism. When people talk about taking race out of the picture, one of the reasons that maybe they're encouraged to do that, or they feel the need to do that, is they don't want to slide into racism. And those are two really different things. Race is, in some ways, a descriptor. It can lead to racism, but race is part of this sort of multi-hued America. And to talk about moving into a post-racial society at a point where America is becoming even more diverse and multi-hued is almost like putting one's head in the sand, because if you look at the demographic changes that are coming in this country, they're profound. They really are. I'll say one last thing about color blindness also. That we always talk about children being colorblind, that we should be more like children, and actually in the research shows that children aren't colorblind.
That's
Children
right.
are, in fact, more aware of differences in race at a very early age for interesting reasons, because that's how children make sense of their world. They learn boys and girls, short, tall, thin, I'm not going to say fat, abundant. That's how they see differences, and part of that is understanding the differences in race. And so when we try to force this colorblind construct on them, it can be very confusing to young children. And part of the research when I was working on this other book, I was planning on writing a whole chapter about this, is that children, in watching adults and in watching the pretzel twist that we go through in trying to describe these things and deal with them, by the time children are about 8 years old, they already attach a certain amount of risk to discussions about race. They'll all, at 8 years old, they'll start to cycle back and try to, peel away from that discussion because they see from us that level of discomfort or sometimes a sort of sanction for even trying to have those conversations. Thank you for your question.
Yes,
I apologize, Tony, but I am so glad I didn't let the cold keep me home. I really have enjoyed this. I'm wondering about the book you started out to write, and if you discovered something that I have experienced and some others have experienced since the election of Obama. I went to a predominantly white college, made a great friend, young white girl, the first week of college. We have been friends until now, and I graduated from high school in 1967. But Obama has split us.
Why?
She's Republican, I'm Democrat. And I found out that we were walking in this duality that you spoke about. And this situation put our friendship on the line. For me, I saw it coming, but I'm one who always toughs things out and wants to fix things. But she's the kind of person who runs from a problem. And I'm thinking, I have to send her your book. I have to send her your postcard, to try to get a conversation going again, because she cut me off. Because I'm the kind of person, I'm direct, she's kind of indirect, and so she'd come at me like this after I have come this way, and we just, I have other associates who have had relations. My sister had a dear set of neighbors. They're like this now. So I'm just wondering if you have experienced any of that in your research that you started to do, or in any of your experiences as a journalist.
Well, it's what you see on the evening news.
Right.
It goes to that conversation.
Right.
I don't think we've entered the post-racial period. Maybe it's the most racial period.
Interesting.
Exactly.
That race is on our minds, and that we're talking about it more than we ever have before.
Right.
The challenge is to stay at the table.
Right.
When she says something that makes you uncomfortable, to hear her out and try to understand her. She might not win you over. One of I've learned so much on this book tour. I've received people's stories, and they've given me their advice, and I will take all that back into the studio, and hopefully you will hear that in the broadcast that I do. I think I've grown. And one of the things that I learned from someone in Salt Lake City, she said, I do a lot of counseling on diversity, and I do a lot of counseling on marriage. And she said, it applies in both cases. It's like going down the rapids. And you have 3 rules that you have to follow when things get tough, when you go through a really difficult period on those rapids. Rule number 1, stay in the boat. Rule number 2, try to stay in the boat. Rule number 3, and excuse me, this is the way she said it, stay in the damn boat. And that sort of applies to race, that you might want to, you're not comfortable with what you hear, but if you can stay in the boat or stay at the table, if you can hear her truth, if you can understand her perspective, she's been your friend for years. Obviously, there's something that you respect and that you love. There's a bond between you.
Right.
And you don't have to agree. You have members of your family that I'm sure you don't agree with. And so if you can figure out how to talk to each other, but I understand it because on one hand, the woman who says if I try to talk about race, if I try to criticize Barack Obama, people automatically think I'm a racist. Maybe I just don't like Obamacare. Maybe I just don't like the idea of a big government. It's possible that maybe race is part of it, but that's worth talking about that too.
It could be politics.
And on the other hand, for Black Americans who often feel that any criticism of Obama feels like they get personally cut. you know, if he falls down and skins his knee, that you bleed a little bit too, that can make that discussion difficult. But if you want to send her a copy of my book.
Thank you so much.
Let's do the final question right over here.
First, I wanted to thank you, Valerie. You did a very cognizant job of interview, complete with gracefully picking up your papers.
Thank you.
I taught school for a long time, and then I worked with the teachers union. I'm going to bring my question real quickly. This is so invaluable to me because I wanted to teach history, social studies, and most of all civics, which was taught to me, and it was invaluable, both in my own discovery of self and discovery of other people. And I grew up right in the midst of all this in the South. I want to ask you, if you, in your discussions, traveling around the country, around the world, wherever you are, if you could encourage that, because it's leaving the schools. They don't teach civics. They don't teach an adequate view of history. When I started teaching here locally at Austin P. Walden, who helped the integration of all the colleges in Georgia with Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes, Dr. Hamilton Holmes, that meant so much to me. But none of the people in the building, it didn't resonate. So I'm saying, in your travels, I would appreciate it so much if you advocated for the people that really teach this. Because this kind of conversation has got to be valid in the age we're living in. And I very much appreciated your being here.
Mission accepted.
I totally agree with you. I think one of the worst things they did was to take government and civics out of high school. Because people don't even understand anymore the role of government, how it works, and the role that we play in it.
This has been a fascinating evening, just to hear. And I think, you know, one of the things that we can do is talk to our families now.
Yes.
You know, I think back to people in my family who have passed away and stories that I have missed. Talk to your families now. I think we owe a great round of applause to Valerie Jackson and Michele Norris.